Hello everybody, and welcome to our second to last lecture. In today's class, we're going to be discussing the area of abnormal psychology, and we'll be doing this by describing the concept of abnormal, essentially discussing the debate and the problems that we have within this field. We're trying to define something that really is the quintessential piece to this particular field. And then after that, we're going to be talking about some major forms of therapy that are now used by people in this particular branch of psychology that we call clinical psychology. Before we get to this idea of therapy, though, we do need to spend considerable time discussing what it is that therapists do and some of the major challenges that they actually encounter. To introduce you to the idea of defining abnormal, some of the problems we run into, I thought we'd do something that's somewhat synonymous with the game. So what we're going to be doing here is I'm going to be introducing you to some individuals, some people that you theoretically are going to pretend you're a therapist and are meeting for the first time. And when you're meeting these individuals and reading the stories that are presented, what I'd want you to do is think about three prominent questions that therapists or individuals who are called intake psychologists have to ask when determining this idea of what they're struggling with and how we define them. The first questions I want you to ask is whether or not the behavior that the person's displaying could be qualified as, well, what we call abnormal or out of the ordinary. The next question I want you to ask is, are these people we're describing considered a danger to themselves or others? And the last question I want you to ask is, should this person be seeking therapy? Should they actually be seeing somebody on a regular basis, or at least seeking some type of treatment for this specific type of behavior that they're displaying? As we progress, you'll see how these questions can sometimes become tough, and even though on the surface they might not seem so difficult to understand. The first person I want you to be introduced to is a man we'll call John P. So we're going to pretend that you as a therapist are sitting in your office. John comes to see you and starts describing his situation. Namely, he says he's developed a debilitating fear for his life. As you see, he sees a stranger on the street as a possible threat and is constantly vigilant for anything around him that might be reflective of hostility. He also has developed a desperate need to remove himself from his surroundings, and he finds himself hiding over and over again in his room in order to avoid those dangers. Now, he's lashed out at times. He's actually hurt a couple individuals, almost hurt others, and he's really, really distraught by this life that he's in. He's trying to run away from all the fear and threats of violence that he encounters, or at least perceives in his environment. If you're a therapist and you're seeing John and this is all you know, let me ask, how many of you think John probably is displaying abnormal behavior? I'm guessing most of you are automatically going to infer that this is abnormal. And the second question, how many of you think he's a danger to himself and others? I'm guessing almost everybody in this class again will make the assumption that John definitely is dangerous. And should he seek therapy? Again, a universal response of yes will probably come up. But what if I were to show you a picture of John that looked like this? What if you saw John not as a normal individual just on the street or somebody that you might pass by on a regular basis, but instead you learned that John was some form of a soldier? Say he was in the Air Force, and that it was his job in some particular war to be surrounded by violence. Again, if we look at this story from John, we might wonder, well, has this particular bit of information changed things? Is his perception of danger really inaccurate? Is his behavior, his concerns, abnormal for somebody in his situation? Should we consider himself a danger to himself and others, even if his particular behavior is completely rational? And should we have him seeking therapy right now? Maybe wait for later? These questions, which seem easy right off the bat, can sometimes become conflicting when we start looking into the life of a person and what's actually going on around them. Another topic I want to discuss is, again, the future. So let's look at one other woman. Call her Susan O. She's a 33-year-old mother of 3 who lives in a small suburban home with her loving husband and children. She's a lucrative and promising job at her local bank, and it says here has been climbing the ladder of success for years. She also, though, which is very important, has recently learned that she is the daughter of God. Not just a regular daughter of God, though. She's actually the messenger of his renewed communication with mankind. As she knows, with this understanding, there's dangers associated with it. Namely, people might come out to hurt her. So she conceals this knowledge and works on conveying the message in private. She locks herself in a room at night so she can write letters that are meant to be the message from her Heavenly Father to humankind, so that someday his or her message will be heard by all and mankind will be saved. Now, if this is what Susan tells you when she comes into your office, you might want to ask, is this behavior abnormal? Most of us, as a knee-jerk reaction, would say yes, but many psychologists ask, where do we draw the line when we talk about heavenly deities or communications with somebody that we call God? With such a huge percentage of the population believing in some type of God, does the belief in a God or a special connection with God necessarily make somebody defined as abnormal? Is there some barrier that she passed when believing that there was something unique about her? How, if we truly do believe in religion, can we separate this possibility of there being something unique about her? This is one of the problems, again, we run into in clinical psychology. Looking at the context, looking at the background of a person to determine if their thoughts, if their behaviors are truly that abnormal. Another question we have, again, was should she be separated? And this one's difficult because right now the voices are telling her to do good things, telling her just write down simple messages. She's got a very promising career and job. So theoretically, it would be very harmful to remove her from her family and from her situation for something that doesn't seem to be a problem now. But clinical psychologists or abnormal psychologists also have to ask, what happens if those voices change? What if she gets a different message? What happens if they tell her now to harm family members or to do something that could harm herself? This is another concern that we have to take into account. Not only how things are impacted now, but how things might play out in the long run. This is just a small glimpse into some of the many struggles that people in clinical psychology have to deal with. One of the things that we see with abnormal psychology, from these examples and in other cases, is that one of the biggest problems we often run into is that it's almost impossible to technically define somebody as being abnormal. And that's because this particular term or this concept can greatly change due to the environment that somebody's in or due to the perception that each individual has with others. When trying to define abnormal psychology, many psychologists nowadays try to create a very overarching concept that can be applied to many different situations. So if we go to the American Psychological Association's definition of abnormal, we say they define it as any behavior that leads to distress, disability, or an increased risk of death, pain, or loss of freedom. And this is for both the person acting and individuals around them. If we go to the textbook and look for the definition of abnormal psychology, they argue, or at least the author James Collett argues, that abnormal behavior is a display of undesirable thoughts and behaviors that are significantly different from the average and interferes with one's life. So rare, impactful, possibly hurting others or causing an increased risk of death, pain for an individual, all can theoretically be assumed by most people to be an accurate assumption of what qualifies somebody as being abnormal. But when we look closer, what we see is that this particular definition, or both of these definitions, might be missing some things. They might actually stretch even too far theoretically. If any of you guys have ever watched television, and watched in particular a classic event that happens in the United States for a number of weeks on any Sunday, what you'll see is a bunch of people walking around in uniforms, sprinting around this giant grass field, beating each other to a pulp, desperately trying to move this tiny ball from one end to the other, and celebrating with each other if they're able to accomplish that. What's really ironic with this particular idea is the fact that most people in the United States culture, and in other cultures as well, don't see anything unusual about this. In fact, most people seem to praise these individuals. But if we go back to the definition of abnormal, what we should be able to quickly recognize is that these people seem to be anything but normal. Their behaviors definitely lead to increased risk of death, pain, and injury. Lots of their behaviors are extremely out of the norm. If you walked down a hall and sprinted as fast as you can when you saw your friend, only to barrel into them and hit them as hard as you can, people would think you were very strange. But for some reason on Sundays, or Saturdays if you're watching college football, this is a celebrated behavior. There's other characters in our past and our current environment that do the same thing. Martin Luther King Jr., a very polarizing figure in the United States many years ago, was somebody that at the time was described by many as being abnormal. His thoughts were different from everybody else. His beliefs pushed things that caused a lot of anxiety within a number of select individuals. Nowadays, we celebrate him. But if we look simply at the APA, theoretically, during his life, during his time, he would be qualified under both definitions as displaying abnormal behavior. The same could be said of President Obama right now. When we look at his behavior, his actions, his thoughts, they definitely caused a lot of controversy, a lot of anxiety, even though there's still a large number of individuals that firmly believe he's a great individual and he's accomplished many things. Based just on the definition, all of these individuals that are celebrated by many could qualify as being abnormal. And the soldier from the first example, even if he's being perfectly healthy, theoretically seems to be, again, displaying what could be qualified as abnormal behavior. So how do we take these things into context? How do we correct for these, what most people believe, egregious errors in defining what is truly abnormal and what qualifies as just kind of, I guess, unusual behavior or extraordinary behavior to some? Well, one of the reasons why we often see problems with these definitions is the fact that most of the time, if we're describing abnormal, one of the big things we have to do is take into account the culture that we're actually looking at. On Sundays, again, and actually most days of the week nowadays, in addition to people watching football, there's another traditional behavior that people engage in called professional wrestling, where they'll dress in very tiny outfits, rolling around trying to desperately pin the other person on a mat. And if you're from another culture, if you've never seen this, this looks exceptionally weird. I mean, imagine you and your friends stripping down to your underwear and desperately trying to place the other person on the ground. It would probably be seen as displaying very, very peculiar behavior by most of your friends. But because in the United States, it's actually also because of this in other cultures, these behaviors have been considered acceptable. Nobody really thinks much about it. Nobody questions these actions of these individuals. In some cultures, though, if you did that, you didn't know about wrestling, you probably would qualify as being abnormal. Another classic example of this is an example of something that people in sub-Saharan Africa and actually some parts of South America experience on a regular basis. In those cultures, what often happens is females will be what we call possessed by demons. And this happens either because of a spiritual thing, or in sub-Saharan Africa, it also sometimes happens because of an accumulation of a lot of stress. In South America and some other regions, these demonic possessions are actually celebrated, encouraged. These people are put in high esteem. In sub-Saharan Africa, when these demons invade females' bodies, women are given a break. They're essentially told to go on a vacation, to travel, to relax, and to get away from their family, and possibly even their abusive husband that's caused these possessions in the first place. For both cultures, these demonic possessions eventually end. There's no thought that these people need to see a therapist. There's no thought that they even need help. Instead, it's just a quick fix or something to be celebrated. If you were in the United States or in East Asia, where these things had never been heard of, then demonic possessions would be treated with a great deal of trepidation. In fact, most people would probably avoid these individuals and assume that these people need a huge amount of therapy and help. Again, the culture determines what's abnormal and what's not. Another example of this is actually something that happens in Western Africa. It's something called brain fag syndrome, where students in those particular areas who have studied very, very hard will experience these debilitating headaches. And they'll be unable to actually think or process information for an extended period of time. So in Western Africa, to treat this, what they'll do is allow these students with these brain fags to have an excused absence for a day or two. If you tried to pull this in a school in the United States or Asia, it would never work. In fact, your teacher would probably send you promptly back to your seat with a scolding for even assuming that you could get away with something like that. In Western Africa, that's considered perfectly normal. It's considered perfectly acceptable to not only display that behavior, but to need that time off. This, again, speaks to how when we're talking about abnormal, we have to consider the culture that we're looking at. What's also interested a lot of psychologists is the fact that we seem to be able to actually produce abnormal behaviors based on the culture that we're in. In the United States, back in the early 60s, all the way up until the 80s, there was a huge onslaught of a specific disorder called multiple personalities, where people would actually break their psyche or their self into different types of individuals. So they wouldn't just be themselves, but they'd be themselves and 3 or 4, maybe just 2 other people. And these personalities were thought to be distinct and usually the product of some type of trauma. Now, when they were first introduced in the 60s, in a very kind of controversial movie called The Many Faces of Eve, nobody had really heard of them. But within a decade, it had become a rampant problem. There were lots of people in the United States terrified that this could become one of the most debilitating and most common disorders out there. What's interesting is the fact that in the 80s, it started to go away. And in fact, nowadays, it's all but disappeared. Very few people, if any, ever experience any symptoms that relate to multiple personalities. And this kind of growth, emergence, and disappearance of this particular disorder shows how important culture is to even the specific abnormal behaviors that are sometimes displayed by individuals. There's other cases of this all over the world as well. In China, back in 2010, just recently, there were a number of incidences where males who were very disgruntled and upset about something proceeded to grab weapons of some sort, a bat, a knife, a sword, whatever they could find, and go to schools, young elementary schools, and had proceeded to attack children, tiny little children, with these instruments, beating many to death or trying to kill as many as humanly possible. We had no idea why this happened, but once it started happening, it became just a rash of incidences all over this country. And ironically, As quickly as it came up, it seemed to have disappeared. Now, there's some indication that China probably suppressed some information on how common this actually was and how many incidences occurred. But the fact that they occurred, the fact that they popped up, is very, very surprising unless we look at how important, again, culture can be to how different disorders develop. In the United States, another major thing that people are struggling with right now, this is actually also common in a lot of other developed countries, is something called anorexia and bulimia. Two major eating disorders that encourage women to not eat very much, and if they don't eat very much, also possibly binge eating a lot and then purging, where they force themselves to throw up. These two behaviors, or these two types of disorders, have become rampant in many colleges around the country, in both the United States and, again, many other developed Western cultures. What's surprising is in many cultures, this particular disorder has never even been heard of. There's never been a single case of it. And this, again, tells us how important culture is when we're talking about defining abnormal. This problem of defining abnormal, though, is just one of the many, many things that therapists have to deal with. In addition to trying to describe when somebody's abnormal or not, therapists are required to determine if a person is a danger to themselves or their community, regardless of whether or not they think their behavior is truly abnormal or not. And then after doing that, they're forced to try to describe and define exactly what is abnormal within the behaviors of the person. And then hopefully as they progress, they can help identify the source of these abnormal behaviors and provide help to these individuals. We're going to be talking about providing help in the next half of class. But I do want to talk briefly about some of the sources that people in the field of clinical psychology now look to when trying to figure out the abnormal behavior that a person's displaying. More often than not, when we're talking about causes to disorders nowadays, in particular in Western and more developed cultures, we focus on something called the biopsychosocial model. It's based on the notion that when trying to define a disorder that somebody's displaying, what we often see is that it's primarily caused by an interaction between our social world, our biological being, and our psychological experiences that we've had. Stresses, traumas, things that we've learned along the way, how to handle things that we're encountering, can easily interact with the environment we find ourselves in and our biological predispositions to create different types of disorders that we've seen. And as an abnormal psychologist, oftentimes in early interviews, what they're trying to do is determine how much of each of these characteristics and which specific types within these characteristics are causing specific disorders to be emerged. So we might look for genes or neurochemistry to try to figure out why somebody's suffering from something like depression. Or we might look at the family and determine where that particular concept plays a role in this person's disorder. The stressors or recent experiences that could possibly be the main triggers to this disorder. More often than not, there's multiple components that have to be considered and addressed in order to help a person truly overcome their disorder. We don't want to go into too much detail about these because you could spend years learning about these concepts. Instead, I want to focus on the last thing that we talked about, and that's how we actually define somebody as being abnormal. What it is, as psychologists, we can do in order to really articulate what somebody's going through.